Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. My guest on today's episode is Ray Brescia. He's a professor at Albany Law School in New York and the author of a new book, The Future of Change: How Technology Shapes Social Revolutions. This is a really great book, and what follows is really a timely and great conversation about how technology, in particular communication technology through history, has advanced social change movements from the founding of our country and the postal service to development of the steam printing press and how that allowed abolitionist organizations to organize more widely and more effectively in the fight against slavery, and then on up into the present with the advent of social media and how that is now being used and in many instances abused in terms of advancing community, local, statewide, national, even international social change movements. We're covering all of this today, including some reflections toward the end from a couple of dinosaurs when it comes to technology on the TikTok generation and how not only is technology advancing as a means of communicating and organizing, but also as a means of activism in and of itself. So we're covering a lot of ground. There's a lot to be concerned about in all of this today, but there's also reason for hope as well in the interest of progress and social change. So I know you'll enjoy this episode. Everybody, please stay safe. As I said last week, I'll say again, please figure out how you're going to vote in November, whether it's through a mail-in ballot or in person. Make sure you are registered. Even if you believe you've registered in the past, there are ways you can check online to make sure indeed you are registered to vote. And let's all do our part as citizens to make sure that we do vote in November in this important election coming up. Stay healthy, wear a mask when you're outside and among people, and enjoy this episode of Good Law, Bad Law. I want to welcome my guest, Ray Brescia. He's a professor of law at Albany Law School and author of the new book, How Technology Shapes Social Revolutions: The Future of Change. I might have gotten actually that backwards. But first of all, Ray, thank you so much for being on Good Law, Bad Law today.
Thanks, Aaron, for having me. And yes, you started with the subtitle. So I think we call that burying the lead. But yeah, the title of the book is The Future of Change: How Technology Shapes Social Revolution.
That's it, exactly. Okay. I'm super excited to talk about this with you today. There's so much in this book, which I've really been enjoying. And it's kind of right up my alley too, as a person who started in the media and journalism before I became a lawyer, and has thought a lot about these issues myself. And then so I want to talk about some of the historical examples you give as to how technology and how communications technology, even more specifically, has helped shaped social progress in this country, going all the way back to the beginnings of our country, and some of the more contemporary examples. And then, of course, there's so much happening right now. I mean, this is the week of the Republican National Convention, last week's DNC. And there's so much happening, I think, in the politics of today that that bears on a lot of what you're writing about. So we can talk about that as well. So start with us, Ray, if you would. Give us some background on yourself and how this is something that you took on. I know this was a labor of love and toil for a number of years for you to get to the point where the book has come out. But give us some of that background.
Sure. Thanks for asking. So the book really, some people said, so how long did it take to write this book? I was probably, formally writing it about 8 years, but it really started, over 20 years ago when in terms of the seeds for it, really in my work right after graduating law school as a lawyer and tenant organizer in Upper Manhattan in communities of color like Harlem and Washington Heights. And really started out representing small grassroots groups, tenant associations in tenement buildings, block associations, other community-based organizations, and really started to think about, well, what helps these people change their lives? What helps folks make change in their lives? And then as I moved into legal academia about 15 years after that, started trying to think more deeply about some of the questions that were sparked from my work, right about the time when technology was accelerating social movements in a lot of ways. And we got things like the Arab Spring and the Occupy movement. And, people were starting to ask, did Twitter launch the Arab Spring? And did Facebook bring about Occupy and the Tea Party and things like that? And so started to sort of think about, not just my own experience as a lawyer for community-based organizations, but also some of this new data that we were having. And I sort of said, like, well, is there a relationship between technology and social movements? And tried to, look back over the course of American history and started to see a pattern where with advances in communications technologies, we also got, this sort of rise of new social movements. And we see, I saw and started to think about, well, if we've got this relationship where, a new means of communication comes online, so to speak, and a new social movement seems to rise up and embrace it, then maybe there is something to this question about, technology and social movements. And as I then started to dig deeper, I, saw that it wasn't just about technology, but it was also about a couple of other things. And so I'll stop there, and then we can, sort of explore some of those other things to see. And I don't think the sort of the conclusion I reached is not that technology, makes social change happen. It's what people do with it and how they use it, and the sort of messages they convey when they're using the technology that all come together to help make social change.
Well, and before we get into some of the older technologies that you explore as part of a historical look back at early social movements, let me just follow up on your early career when you were working in Upper Manhattan, because I too started my career to a certain extent in Upper Manhattan. I was, as a young guy, writing for what we used to call the seventh largest daily newspaper in New York, the Columbia Spectator. And one of the issues that I happened to write about a lot in my freshman and sophomore years in college was about community relations between this big sprawling university and the communities around, and tenant relations and community organizing, and got to know a lot of people. This was, I think, if I'm counting the years correctly, before you were there. So what, just in that, because I think a lot of people understand what community organizing means, broadly speaking, how did you, in your years when you were working for legal aid and working on those issues, how did you see, as you call it, the seeds of what you then come to write about? How did you see technology as a part of those very local social movements?
So I was working at, really at the absolute grassiest roots of the grassroots in working with individual tenants working within tenant associations. So you just that's the that is the end of the network, right? In terms of the terminus of the network. And these, my clients and I would communicate at the time. The fax machine was the sort of technology that we used a lot. The telephone, I We had voicemail. So if I was in court, my clients would leave, long, detailed messages for me, and I would, call them back and probably leave detailed messages for them as well if they were at work during the day. So the technology really facilitated that. I didn't have to go door to door to communicate with my clients, although sometimes we did. Sometimes we would, if we were trying to build a tenant association, add new members to the association. I would walk around with the tenant leaders and literally knock on doors and have face-to-face interactions with them. So it was still quite laborious. I think today, I started doing that work in 1992. Today that organizing is very, very different. Nearly 30 years later, where you've got Twitter and Facebook. In the book, I go into some of the ways that social media is helping to advance communications. People are creating Facebook groups and seeing, almost overnight new members joining. And so in just those, several decades, probably we've seen some of the greatest advances in the ability to communicate and the ability to organize. I still think that we need that face-to-face interaction, even in the time of COVID, to formalize and strengthen those bonds. But we're seeing that people are using social media in really creative and effective ways to make it easier to get the initial contact underway that is then solidified in many ways on the streets, in the union halls, where we can and do meet in a socially distanced and safe way. We're still using social media really effectively.
Well, and if you listen to Mark Zuckerberg talk about Facebook, the one word that stands out whenever I've heard him speak is connectivity.
Connection and community, absolutely.
Right, a connection as a means to community, and you break that out into three components, which you call the matrix, which I don't know if you were thinking of the reference to the movie and what that might suggest about a different kind of connection, but you call this the matrix as you then look through varying moments in the history of social movements and the evolution of technology and communications, and those three components are the medium, network, which I guess is another way of thinking about community, and message. So we can't obviously go through all of the examples that you look at in detail, but maybe you could pick one or kind of give us an overview of how those three components, medium, network, and message, apply, whether it's the advent of the postal service at the beginning of the founding of our country or early on, or the radio, as FDR used in the fireside chats, or television and the connection to the civil rights movement, and how historically you've seen this connection between developments particularly in communication technology and the ability to better advance social change.
Sure. So you've got that right. So the social change matrix has those three components. It's the most advanced means of communications available to the group, combined with a network and a particular type of network, which I'll get to in a moment, and then a unifying positive message. And so let's look at one of the examples that I go into in the book in some detail, which is the Abolitionist Movement. So the Abolitionist Movement against slavery in the that gets started, really at the founding of the Republic, or he's got this, the origins at the founding of the Republic, but really starts to take off about 40, 50 years later with the advent of the steam printing press. Mm-hmm. So I go into in the book and the relationship between the printing press and the American Revolution. but it's the steam printing press in the sort of 1830s that the introduction of that coincides with this growth of the abolitionist movement, and what makes the steam printing press so effective for them is that it becomes much easier, faster, and cheaper to print the abolitionist tracts, and then those tracts are used to promote the abolitionist cause, and spreading the abolitionist message throughout the nation using the postal system, and so they embrace this technology. It helps to advance the abolitionist cause. But they don't just use the technology, they also organize into what I call a translocal network, which is local chapters connected to regional, state, and national movements, because there are several abolitionist groups that form in this way. And they really do it combining, using the postal system to send out information to towns, to get people to create their own society, their own local chapters of these abolitionist societies. But they also send out what they call agents. So individuals going town to town, sort of riding circuit, if you would, to meet face to face with people, to create local chapters of these abolitionist societies. And so you've got this translocal network, if you want to use a franchise model, but in a lot of ways they mimic the postal system, because they where there's a post office, there tends to be a chapter, and they can the regional, state, and national groups can send information to these local chapters, and they can learn about activities. They can, petitions are sent to them to sign and send on to Congress. And then, so you've got the technology, you've got this translocal network, and then you've got a message. And if you look at the abolitionist literature from the time, it really is about, it's got, religious tone to it in many respects, but it talks about, our salvation is tied up in the freedom from slavery. Our destiny is tied up in the shared humanity between the free individuals, whites, and enslaved individuals, enslaved blacks, and that our shared destiny, our shared humanity leads us to a desire to abolish slavery. Now, of course, there are many who don't share this vision, and we fought a very bloody civil war to ultimately abolish slavery. But it's the groundwork that is laid by the abolitionists that creates a moment where that cause can be carried, and that idea of shared destiny is seen in the ultimate effort of the northern states to abolish slavery, and Lincoln really embodies this, where he says, the end of slavery is necessary to save the Union, and to save the Union we must abolish slavery. He really ties those causes together, and it is what is it's realized in the Emancipation Proclamation in so many ways, in that the cause of slavery, the cause of fighting slavery and saving the Union and putting together an army to save the Union are all tied up in freeing the slaves in the southern states. And one of the elements of the Emancipation Proclamation is the fact that that the Union will arm African Americans to fight on the side of the Union, and that, for those people who are who care less about the cause of slavery and more about the cause of saving the Union, they see that, you know, we need more troops. And so they will support the cause of ending slavery, at least in the southern states, right? Like the Emancipation Proclamation doesn't free the slaves in the states that still have slavery that are part of the Union, right? So it's a very carefully calibrated effort designed to bring the interests together. And that's the third piece, right? The shared interests, shared destiny, shared humanity.
So, and what's also interesting about that, and as I'm listening, I'm thinking about how this applies to what we see going on today in different social movements and how they're being organized, which is that the technology that you're talking about here, the steam printing press, and also I would think too, newspapers, I mean, just the spread of, you know, local newspapers across the country, is not only does it allow you to build a community between the organization that's promoting whatever the social change is, whatever abolitionist group we're talking about, and those who you're trying to bring into the movement. But it also provides a way of creating cohesion within the organization, where you might have member chapters or member local units of the organization spread out pretty far, and have to have some ability to communicate and develop a coherent message. This, you know, ending slavery as a means to salvation, for example, having a coherent message that you can then communicate consistently within your organization. So it seems like the technology is essential, even with primitive technology that we're talking about now, in both ways.
That's right. And the message, you know, people have to identify with the message, with the group that is furthering the message. And it is a way to galvanize people. And you know, fast forward to the present, what we're seeing now, you know, in those prior settings, you know, the message would often come down from on high. It would be filtered down. It might be, you know, fine-tuned to meet the needs of a particular community. And that's one of the benefits of having the translocal network, is that you have a local leader who's got the trust, who's got the relationships at the local level, who might, you know, tweak the message a little bit, filter it a little bit, so that, you know, it's received better at the local level. What we're seeing today is, you know, with the ability to, you know, share messages, not just from the top down, but also from the bottom up, that really interesting messages are coming up and filtering up through networks. And, you know, better messages, more galvanizing messages. One of the stories I go into in the book is the effort in 1992, in 2012, 2013, to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act. And the advocates who are fighting for that reauthorization in Congress used really smart hashtags, you know, real VAWA and other things to you know, get voices that were perhaps not you know, in leadership to help to shape the message, to help personalize the need for a strengthened VAWA, because people could share their stories of intimate partner violence. Similarly, another story I recount is from a couple years ago, the West Virginia teachers strike. And you know, people in a Facebook group could share memes, could share stories, could share funny signs that they were making, you know, on their kitchen table. And those, you know, those signs and stories and memes filtered up and were then shared throughout the network as a way to galvanize people and encourage them to stay engaged and to get engaged and then to stay engaged. So whereas in prior eras, those messages might come down from on high from leaders. With social media, we can, that information can bubble up, and there's, we're not reliant on those leaders for these messages that may resonate better.
Hashtag Me Too is another one. I mean,
that's perfect example. Perfect example.
Who would have thought that we would credit a hashtag on Twitter with making such a contribution to a social change movement? But I think it's undeniable in that case.
Right, and if you just take those 5 letters, it really it sort of embodies what I'm talking about with these sort of shared humanity, personalized messages. Nothing says that better than Me Too. That happened to me as well.
Mm-hmm.
We share these experiences,
right.
and that's that kind of message is an inclusive one, and helps to galvanize support and helps people to identify with the movement.
Well, and the other thing I'm thinking about as I was listening to you talking about how messages, before we had modern means of communication with modern technology like social media, how messaging about a movement would filter from the top down, and Me Too, or the Violence Against Women Act and other examples you talk about in the book have allowed contributions to the messaging of the movement to also filter up. The other example I'm thinking of, I've watched my own daughter, who's active in a climate change organization, and even in a time of pandemic. I mean, here we're on Zoom, and we've only started using Zoom for our podcast, I don't know, a month or two ago. And I'll tell you, I wish we'd done it long ago, because it's so nice to see you as I'm talking with you, but in watching my daughter and how she's working in this organization she's now part of, it's about messaging, but it's also about process. It's not just about galvanizing voters. It's not just about getting a message out, or even creating a medium to receive contributions to the messaging. It's also really about the process. And when you have communication made so easy, so available, through something like Zoom, let's say, an older version of that, I guess, would be a conference call. But Zoom's even better because you can see one another. You can also advance your social agenda through the process of how you involve people in the developing of the message. That seems pretty revolutionary, actually.
I agree, and I think that goes to it is the interaction of the 3 components of the social change matrix. Yeah. It's the means of communication, it's the network, and it's the message. And there's something about this is a form of face-to-face communication, but there is something about face-to-face communication, repeat interactions, expressions of support and empathy and deliberation that builds the trust that is necessary for social change movements and organizations to operate, right? Yeah. A grassroots group or an organization that is founded to promote democratic principles can't operate like an autocracy. And so, the groups that organize themselves into these translocal networks are better able to build that trust that is necessary for groups to succeed. I go into an example of a group that sort of came about in the 70s. And I won't name it, but I name it in the book. And
you can name it if you want to.
that there was no, there was it was a top-down organization, and there were members that were part of the top-down organization, but members in name only. And those members were like, hey, I would imagine there are other members in my community that I'd love to meet and love to get to know, and maybe we could work on stuff together. And so they reached out to the leadership and said, do you have ideas for how this, the group can, how members could meet? And the group said, well, yeah, you could get together and have a watch party and watch our leader on the morning news shows. Like, well, that's not how you build an organization. And so it's one of the things I go into in the book is there was a time, and I talked about the fax machine earlier, but there's a critical moment in social movements that occurs by virtue of the introduction of a new means of communication. And that is, sort of in the late 60s, early 70s, there is a new means of communication that is introduced, and that is the ability to create a computerized mailing list. And
I thought that story was fascinating.
With that, right at the sort of peak of the success of the civil rights movement, when they, it's not Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. It's the Civil Rights Act of 64. It's the Voting Rights Act of 65. It's the Fair Housing Act of 68. These monumental pieces of legislation are passed because of the hard work of the civil rights movement, combining, as you alluded to before, medium, network, and message, and the means of communication that was best available to them at the time was the television. The new groups arise and sort of form and say, hey, we want what they've got, but what they coalesce around in many respects is this ability to create a computerized mailing list. And we see it, it's not a progressive group, but we see it if your audience has watched Mrs. America, and I imagine many of them have, Phyllis Schlafly's mailing list it's almost a character in the show. And it's downloaded at the end in a giant floppy disk. And just like, as a student of this, I'm just, I was so excited when I saw that. But in that moment, we see that, organizing now sort of centers around the ability to send mailings out to people. And it's computerized was the key word in that phrase, though, because you have a mailing list that you send through the mail. It's very different. You can send something out through a mailing list via email. I mean, that's right. But it takes the grassroots organizing, that face-to-face translocal organizing, out of the equation. And so we get, 4 decades almost of this style of organizing, if you would, that's very top down. There are certainly groups that work at the grassroots level that support grassroots efforts, but a lot of it is this, and some historians and sociologists call it, sort of bodiless heads, that there are these top-down organizations based in New York and DC and LA, and not really focused on that grassroots face-to-face organizing. And ironically, as I go into in the book, we're seeing some of that change now with social media, that we have this great ability to communicate, but we're also seeing people recreating the old style of organizing at the local level, which is really exciting.
Well, you mentioned Arab Spring. So there are still ways in which the newer technologies are being used in social movements, whether it's on the progressive side or on the conservative side, not just in how messages are disseminated, but also in moving people into places where they can meet. I mean, it'd be fascinating to think about how the civil rights protests and marches and sit-ins and freedom rides would have been different if they'd had access to social media that we have today. So we do see some examples of that. I mean, the Black Lives Matter protests have benefited from access to social media and other forms of communication, for example, in not just their messaging, but in mobilizing people to act in some way, whether it's in a protest or reaching out to legislators or local political figures, right? I mean, talk about that a little bit, because I think that's maybe where we are right now.
Absolutely. And so I there's a couple of strands to this response. If you give me, as we would say, Your Honor, if you give me a little leeway here. So,
try your case, counsel.
Thank you, Your Honor. So first, in the first instance, let's talk about, police violence against people of color. I don't think anyone thinks that we have a new epidemic of this problem. It's just being filmed now. And so in many ways, much like, John Lewis, we saw images of John Lewis being beaten on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, how that galvanized the nation and really set the stage for the passage of the Voting Rights Act. We see now these horrific incidents being recorded on smartphones and being disseminated over social media, really, galvanizing support and raising awareness. So number one, the technology is making this, bringing to light this problem. I have no doubt in my mind, and we saw it initially before the video came out of George Floyd's murder. Oh, he was resisting arrest. Oh, he's this, hulking guy. He was a bouncer. But then America saw what happened. I think that, many of these incidents, we would get a very different story if the videos weren't taken of these incidents. So that's number one. Number two, if, in recent memory, and one, as I said before, I go into the story of the West Virginia teacher strike, but, whether it's the Moms Demand Action or, the March for Our Lives, there's a similar repeating pattern. The Portland protests, when the mothers, came out to protect the protesters, using their privilege to do that. The story is very similar in many instances, and someone will say, I created a Facebook group. I thought that we would have, 20 people or 100 people join the Facebook group. And then almost overnight, we had 1,000, or, in a matter of weeks, we had 20,000, as the case with the West Virginia teachers strike. So, the technology, in addition to helping to spread messages and images and galvanizing support, it also helps people to organize and coordinate and find each other.
Yeah.
And then get out into the streets. So, this new technology, which is in everybody's hands, it's not dependent on a leader, pushing out information. It comes organically up from within the grassroots. So it's those three components, being able to share messages, being able to find like-minded people, and being able to coordinate their actions, that social media is helping to supercharge this advocacy. Now, you can say, yes, is it just progressive groups? No, of course not. We're also seeing, alt-right folks organize using 8chan and lots of other networks that are available to them. But, that's always been the case. The radio was used by FDR very effectively, but it was also, the Nazis made sure that, every family had a cheap radio receiver in their home, so that they could hear the Nazi bile. And so, and at the same time, I mentioned John Lewis, the late, great John Lewis. He heard Martin Luther King on the radio, and it helped, awaken in him that, the hero and advocate as a very young teen. So, these, Brad Smith from Microsoft calls this technology, both tools and weapons, and absolutely that's what they are. And so we have to, progressive groups can't put down these tools, even though they're also used by the forces aligned against them.
Well, and weapon is exactly the word that I was thinking about again as I was listening, and what I wanted then to turn to, which is, because it's fascinating to think that so many social change movements have had to be grassroots in some sense because of the nature of the technology that was available at the time. And here we're seeing in 2020, perhaps a return to the ultimate grassroots type of movements with the kind of technology that we have available today. But it does seem disturbingly more clear than ever that technology can also be used as a weapon. I mean, to reveal a bit of my own bias, I mean, watching the convention this week reminds me of, the documentary filming of the Nuremberg rallies. I mean, the potential to use social media, to use technology today to advance against a social change movement, not just to advance your own ideas, but to actually advance against a social change movement through misinformation, through outright false information, through distorted information in words and pictures and memes. It's only a few weeks ago that Twitter flagged our president's Twitter account in a couple of examples to say, we're going to crack down on a message that we know to be false or misleading on something as important as the coronavirus, for example. So how does that factor in an age where I don't even know that we can say there aren't facts? I don't know that we can even say what truth is anymore. At least there's enough to be skeptical and cynical about what facts are and what truth is. How does technology in terms of social movements play in that regard?
So it's very difficult. I think that thankfully, in some ways, there is science that, with respect, let's just talk about the coronavirus catastrophe that we're facing right now, is that we do have verifiable science behind the much of the public health work that's being done.
The CDC revised guidelines the other day on the very day that Anthony Fauci was under anesthesia having a surgical procedure done. I've heard people say, leading figures say today, I no longer trust the CDC.
No, I think that's absolutely fair. But what I'm trying to get to is we still, it's almost like, who are you going to believe? Me or your lying eyes, right? And so people can see what is going on around them. And I think that if there was, stuff, if there were squishy facts, if there were things that could be, skewed in certain ways, it's harder to disabuse people of their preconceived notions, confirmation bias. They want to believe something. It's easier to disabuse people of those notions when there are verifiable facts, and still people may disagree with them. But I think that when you hear the CDC saying something like, we're going to discourage people from testing when there are no symptoms, when I think most people know that the most dangerous period in Corona is when people are asymptomatic, because that's when they're most at risk of spreading it.
Yep.
And we've got data coming out now that we can do. There's some very rapid testing that can be done. It's very inexpensive. It may not be accurate 100%, but if you can do it because it's so inexpensive and it picks up people when they are asymptomatic, i.e. when they're at most risk of spreading it. And the worst thing happens is you get a false positive. That means you stay home, you don't go to school, you don't go to work. And then the next day you get an accurate, you get a false positive, you stay home. And then the next day you get a negative test that would indicate that maybe the day before it was a false positive. The worst thing that's happened is you've stayed home from work or school for a day. Like, I think we're starting to, the reality of this virus is starting to hit most people. And we saw the, and the still unfolding tragedy in states where they didn't take it seriously, has gotten people to realize that, hey, maybe we need to wear a mask. Maybe we need to test more. Maybe we need to be more careful. I hope. And so the fortunate thing with some of this is it's, because we've got the videos now, because we've got a virus that actually has, is a reality-based virus, if you would, and we're starting to understand the science of it better, that when people say things like, inject bleach into your veins, people are saying, well, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So it's a long way of saying, I think that, people can use social media certainly to spread disinformation, but that disinformation can be verified in some instances. It's easier to throw up dust and say, oh, investigations of, Hunter Biden, mean that, where there's smoke, there's fire. Like, that's, if you want to believe that, you're going to believe it. It's harder to say that around something like coronavirus. Will people continue to say it? Yes, of course. But, we've got these tragic stories of people on their deathbed, before they go on a ventilator, saying, I thought it was all a hoax.
Right. Exactly.
Oh my God. I mean, it's, there's a lot of stuff that you can lie about, but sometimes you can't lie about science.
Well, and that's why I always appreciate, for example, the way you've approached the topic, which is you have to look at the history, because it's not just of curious interest. There are lessons there that help us understand where we are today. And so, it should be obvious, but we know too, the period of disinformation and alternative facts and things like that today. It's not the first time in our history we've seen this. I mean, we can talk about the printing press and the rise of newspapers through the steam printing press and how that advanced an educated citizenry and an educated social movement through that means of communication. But we also had William Randolph Hearst and yellow journalism. We know that too. We can say, well, the advance of video on smartphones allows us to see with our own eyes. And we certainly saw that with John Lewis in Selma. But we also saw that a couple of decades later in LA with Rodney King, where there was a video. And yet, that case turned out very differently. So it's not the first time we've had this push and pull in terms of what is the truth or what are we actually seeing or understanding given the limitations of our technology. But it feels like today, maybe because we've never had means of communication be quite so widely available. Everybody's got a smartphone with a camera on it today. Everybody, nearly everybody. So what positive and negative do you see as we look ahead in how social change movements grapple with that today? I mean, anybody can set up a blog in their basement. You have an internet connection and make a living on the click hits that you get with some article. Right. That we just know these things are out there. So how do you think that affects the way social change organizations have to wrestle with those challenges today, perhaps has been different at other points in history?
So I think that, one other, the next logical step that we're going to see, even with videos, is deep fakes, right? Yeah. These ideas that we can, you can manipulate videos and, you can distort them, or you can just create, you can really, create anything and make it look like somebody's doing something or saying something.
Make it sound like it's their voice. Would be their voice, but saying words that they didn't actually say.
That's right. Or even, we're seeing with Speaker Pelosi, distorting it to slur her speech, make it seem like she's, drunk or something. They're doing it with Vice President Biden as well. So I think that one of the things that we can work with is we all, I say we, progressive advocates, we can also fall into a form of groupthink. We can also fall into confirmation bias, but there's the risk of fake news, the risk of false information that can be utilized from anybody can promote a false narrative. And so one of the things I talk about in the book, and I reference a paper called The Emperor's Dilemma by Santola, Willer, and Macy, and in it they talk about how to sort of combat this confirmation bias, this this group thing, is that share information with people who aren't necessarily in your inner circle. First off, when you get information, always look at the source, always check the source, but also share it with someone who doesn't necessarily see everything eye to eye with you, to see what the holes are. Is the information does it pass their smell test? Does it are you falling victim to some group think? And that that we see studies of media today, and where you've got echo chambers more false information is promoted. And as Yochai Benkler and his fellow researchers have studied the sort of media landscape, and they show that more fake news is actually promoted on the more conservative side of the media, because it's more of an echo chamber. They don't do fact checking as rigorously as media outlets on the center and the left do. They don't adhere to journalistic principles and ethics as closely as more centrist and more left-leaning media outlets do, because there is that groupthink that the fake news is more readily shared within those echo chamber type silos. And in order to act on facts and principles, we need to ensure that we are fact-checking ourselves and adhering to those sorts of principles of truth and honesty, because I think that the truth will out. We saw the white citizens councils organized in translocal networks in the 50s and 60s to combat the civil rights movement, but the reality of civil rights, support for civil rights was really won the day in many respects, because of people seeing the cause of civil rights being important to advance the nation.
But again,
I'm hopeful that we'll be there today.
But that was television at a time when people still had some fairly high degree of trust in the medium of television and video. And so when John Lewis is beaten on the bridge in Selma, or when the children in Birmingham have the hoses turned on them, or at other moments when Americans who didn't live in those places and didn't know, maybe only had read about or heard from people in the equivalent of their echo chambers at the time, saw it on TV for themselves with their own eyes, they believed it and were horrified by what they saw. And that's I guess what worries me today, is that seeing isn't necessarily believing anymore, or trust in so many of our institutions, from the Supreme Court to the CDC to, I don't know, you can create a long list.
The post office.
The post office. I mean, it's just a high level of distrust and cynicism in what is true anymore.
Well, I think that's fair. And I sort of, I was a throwaway line about the post office. Actually, Americans trust the post office.
Yeah.
It's people,
it's been politicized now, but
I see it being politicized, and people are trying to undermine trust in the post office in a way to undermine trust in the ballot and the vote and the outcome. I mean, we as a nation are being primed for a constitutional crisis. We are seeing it unfold in slow motion. That we are being the ground is being set for a challenge to the outcome of the election.
Yeah.
Undermining efforts to undermine virtually every aspect of the election, so that there can be a challenge to its outcome.
No question.
If it turns out that the president loses on election night, loses the re-election bid, the groundwork is being laid for the challenges to come to those results.
No doubt.
I mean, plain and simple. I hate to. It is absolutely terrifying, heartbreaking, and shocking that a nation that is founded on the democratic process and the peaceful transition to power, the groundwork is being laid in front of our eyes for a resistance to the peaceful transition of power.
No doubt about it. Well, let me wrap up. There's one other area I wanted to ask you about to bring back to the question of technology and social change movements and organizing. And uh, because I think most of what we've talked about in terms of technology is relating technology and developments in technology to advances in the medium of communication. But it also seems there's some examples I was thinking about as I was reading the book of technology that is used as a form of action and not just as a medium of communication. And you alluded to this earlier when we talk about weaponizing of technology and communication technology. Of course, whether something is a weapon, I, I think depends on your perspective and where you're coming from. There's no question that Russian bots, putting fake trolling sites up on Facebook and Twitter. I mean, those are clearly weapons. I think we would have to all agree because they come from some outside foreign, influencers. But even within, I'm thinking in particular actually of some young people who've mobilized with TikTok, which is where you can record a short video of yourself, often doing dance moves to some new song, but it's really expanded beyond that. And in particular, I was thinking about the president's rally in Tulsa a couple of months ago when, as I understand it anyway, a lot of people organized through TikTok to register for tickets to the Tulsa rally, which were free, which were given out free, but you had to sign up for it, and then didn't show up. And so they basically, created the impression among the organizers of that rally, I guess the president's reelection campaign organizers, that they were going to have a huge turnout. And then they actually had a tiny turnout because TikTok had been used as a form of activism, or people who are going onto the Trump 2020 app and buying Trump merchandise and then leaving it in their shopping cart and not buying it as a way of, it's kind of a form of activism. It's not a protest happening out in the street. It's not a leaflet campaign. It's not a door-to-door knocking, canvassing campaign. But here, technology that is a kind of communications technology is being used as part of a social movement. I mean, it's political, but I'm wondering if you think we'll see more of that either for a social change agenda or as a way of resisting or trying to oppose a social change agenda in the future. I mean, is that set an example of a new way to use social media technology, not merely as a means of communicating or building community, but communicating, building community, and then actually using that medium as a form of action?
For sure. We'll definitely see that. I think we will, it's interesting, the TikTok generation, if you would, the students from Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, these digital natives, as they're sometimes called, people who grew up with digital technologies, they are going to teach us how to use, as they already are going to teach us how to use this technology better than we ever could. I mean, it's almost laughable sometimes, and I don't want to use weapons as a metaphor, but it's the old line about bringing a knife to a gunfight. When you see some congressperson, in his or her 50s or 60s, trying to send out a tweet criticizing AOC or the gun reform advocates or the Sunrise Movement, and then they in response they just run circles around those, people of my generation
Yeah.
who think they're being clever. I mean, it is pathetic, actually, when you see how, the older generations are trying to use social media in the face of folks who grew up with it. They're much better at this than we are.
But that's again, and you have a historical look through these issues in your book. I mean, that's how it's been throughout history. And again, you tell the story of the RNC executive who went to the Library of Congress and wrote down the names of 12 index cards, 3x5. Oh my God, do people even know what an index card is anymore? 3x5 index card in the Library of Congress of donors to Republican campaigns. And because it was the early 60s and now you have the advent and access to computers, you've got an email mailing list or a mailing list anyway that you can have computerized. Who could have imagined then how that would revolutionize the way all organizations, not just political organizations, would organize among their members? So it's just this is the social revolution in terms of technology we have today.
Absolutely, and
you and I are too old to fully appreciate where it could take.
Where it's going to go. I totally agree, and it's the old line, necessity is the mother of invention, and that I think that if people are motivated, I sort of try and think about creativity and creativity and advocacy a lot, and nothing makes someone more creative than the need to find to solve a problem.
Yeah.
And the need for social change is a problem. Like it's a problem solving sort of approach that social change advocates have. There's a problem that we need to solve, and the most creative people are the people who reach around for the tools that are at their reach, and use them in new and creative ways. That's how creativity has worked from the time we were swinging from the trees, as they say, right? And that's what social change advocates have always done, is that they've reached out for the tools that at their disposal and used them in new and creative ways. And in a lot of ways, the availability of these new tools have sparked imagination as well. And Frederick Douglass talked about how the new means of communication was giving people the notion that change is possible. The women's movement in the 40s and 50s of the 19th century said, like, the telegraph and the railroad. This is these are things that are harbingers of change. So we see that these new tools at people's disposal helps people think anew about how they can be used, because we need them to change the world, and that lights a fire in people to think creatively about how to use them effectively.
Well, I love that as a note to end on. A time of great worry, but also a time of great hope. And so much to look forward to and be engaged in, and I just really appreciate not only the way you've approached this, but also some of the practical suggestions for how people can think about these things in their own individual lives. Ray Brescia, thank you so much. Ray's a professor at Albany Law School in New York, and the author, I'm going to get it right this time, The Future of Change, How Technology Shapes Social Revolutions. Fascinating, great conversation this morning. And thank you. I mean, we'll put a link to the book so people can get it. I encourage everybody to do that. There's so much in the book. I've really enjoyed reading it and learned a lot, and really enjoyed speaking with you today.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity, and it's been a great conversation on my end as well. Thank you.